What if I told you that the most powerful people in any room aren't the loudest or the most confident, but the ones who've done something most people never will? Stay with me, because what depth psychology reveals about shadow integration will completely change who you trust, who you follow, and who you become. Here's something that will blow your mind. Most people are walking around with half of themselves locked in a psychological basement. They've hidden away their darkness, their rage, their selfishness, their capacity for cruelty. They think they're being good by denying these parts exist. But Carl Jung discovered something revolutionary. These denied parts don't disappear. They run the show from the shadows. But there's a rare breed of individual who's done the unthinkable. They've walked into that basement, faced what's down there, and integrated it into their conscious awareness. And once you learn to spot them, you'll never unsee it. According to Jung's groundbreaking research on the psyche, the shadow contains everything we've rejected about ourselves. The anger we were told was unacceptable, the selfishness we were shamed for, the darkness we were taught to fear. Most people spend their entire lives running from these parts. But the integrated individual? They've turned around and embraced the monster. And paradoxically, that's what makes them safe. Listen carefully to what happens next, because this is where everything becomes clear. The first sign of shadow integration is something depth psychology calls comfortable discomfort. When you're around someone who's integrated their shadow, you'll notice they can sit with tension without rushing to fix it. They can hear criticism without becoming defensive. They can acknowledge their flaws without spiraling into shame. Why? Because they've already met the worst parts of themselves and survived the encounter. But here's where it gets absolutely fascinating. People who haven't integrated their shadow need to be right. They need to be seen as good, moral, justified. Every conversation becomes a performance of their virtue. But the shadow-integrated individual, they've transcended the need for constant validation. They can admit when they're wrong because their self-worth isn't fragile anymore. They can acknowledge their dark impulses because they're not terrified of them. They've made peace with their complexity, and that peace is palpable. Here's what research on psychological wholeness reveals. When someone integrates their shadow, their energy fundamentally shifts. They stop leaking anxiety through people-pleasing. They stop radiating aggression through passive hostility. They become what Jung termed energetically coherent. What they think, feel, and express are aligned. You can feel this alignment the moment you meet them. According to depth psychology, shadow integration creates what's called bidirectional empathy. These individuals can hold compassion for both victim and perpetrator because they've acknowledged their own capacity for both roles. They understand human darkness not theoretically but experientially. They've touched their own cruelty, their own selfishness, their own capacity for harm. And this makes them the most trustworthy people you'll ever meet. But here's the part that will send chills down your spine. Someone who's integrated their shadow doesn't perform morality. They embody ethics. There's a massive difference. Performers need audiences. They need recognition for their goodness. But the integrated individual, they do the right thing even when no one's watching because their conscience is internal, not external. They're not trying to prove they're good. They've accepted they're capable of both good and evil, and they consciously choose good anyway. Listen to how they speak about others. People with unintegrated shadows gossip, judge, project their darkness onto others. They need villains to maintain their identity as heroes. But shadow-integrated individuals? They speak about even difficult people with nuance. They can criticize behavior without dehumanizing the person. They recognize the shadow in others because they've recognized it in themselves. They practice what Jung called conscious judgment over unconscious projection. Here's what happens when you challenge someone who's done this deep work. They don't crumble or attack. They pause. They consider. They might even thank you for the feedback. Why? Because they're not defending a fragile persona anymore. They're operating from what psychology calls integrated self-concept. They know they contain multitudes, contradictions, and complexities. Your criticism isn't an existential threat, it's just information. Research on shadow work reveals something extraordinary. People who've integrated their darkness develop what's called authentic confidence. Not the performative kind that needs constant reinforcement, not the arrogant kind that masks insecurity, but the quiet kind that comes from knowing yourself completely, including the parts you're not proud of. They don't need to dominate conversations or prove their intelligence. They're secure in their wholeness. But here's where the transformation becomes absolutely unmistakable. Shadow-integrated individuals have a specific relationship with power. They're not afraid of it, but they're not drunk on it either. They can hold authority without becoming authoritarian. They can assert boundaries without becoming cruel. They understand that the capacity for tyranny lives in everyone, including themselves. And that understanding makes them incredibly careful with their power. According to Jung's research, people who face their shadow develop what he termed moral complexity. They don't see the world in black and white anymore. They understand that good people do bad things, that bad people have reasons, not excuses, but reasons. They've abolished the simplistic categories of pure good and pure evil because they've discovered both within themselves. This doesn't make them relativistic. It makes them wisely discerning. Here's another telltale sign. Watch how they handle their anger. Unintegrated people either suppress anger until they explode or express it toxically without restraint. But someone who's integrated their shadow, they can feel rage without being consumed by it. They can express anger clearly without becoming abusive. They've befriended this emotion instead of fearing or indulging it. They've learned what depth psychology calls emotional sovereignty. But here's what will absolutely transform how you see people forever. Shadow-integrated individuals don't need enemies. Think about that. Most people define themselves through opposition. They need someone to be wrong so they can be right. They need someone to hate so they can feel righteous. But the integrated person has faced their own inner enemy and won that battle. They don't need external villains anymore. They're too busy managing the complexity within themselves. Research shows that these individuals often have histories of deep personal crisis. They've been broken by life in ways that forced them underground into their own psyche. They've faced addiction, betrayal, failure, or loss so profound that denial was no longer an option. And in that darkness, they found parts of themselves they'd been running from their whole lives. The crisis became the catalyst for integration. Here's the final piece that makes them absolutely unmistakable. Shadow-integrated people have what Jung called playful relationship with darkness. They can joke about their flaws. They can laugh at their own absurdities. They don't take themselves so seriously because they've already seen the worst of who they are and chosen to keep living anyway. This isn't self-deprecation. It's self-acceptance at the deepest level. According to depth psychology, these individuals become what's termed psychologically complete. Not perfect, complete. They've retrieved all the parts of themselves they'd banished. They've integrated the rejected, the shameful, the terrifying, and in doing so, they've become more human, not less. They're the walking proof that wholeness requires embracing what we'd rather deny. When you encounter someone like this, you'll feel something unusual, safety and challenge simultaneously. They make you feel accepted exactly as you are, yet they inspire you to be more. They don't judge your darkness because they've made peace with their own, yet they hold a standard that calls you upward. They are both mirror and light, reflecting your shadow while illuminating your potential. This is how you spot someone who's integrated their shadow, not by their perfection, but by their wholeness, not by their moral performance, but by their authentic ethics, not by their denial of darkness, but by their conscious relationship with it. They've done the work most people avoid their entire lives, and it shows in every interaction, every decision, every moment of unexpected grace under pressure. And once you recognize them, you'll understand that shadow integration isn't about becoming someone different. It's about becoming completely yourself, darkness and all, and choosing light anyway.